I'm Scott Allen Miller. This is my life living in Nicaragua. I was driving to and from Managua recently and had some time to think to myself as I drove around the city and saw lots of different neighborhoods and think about all the great places there are to potentially live and invest and to grow, and how we as expats can do a good job. And always when having these kinds of conversations with other people and with myself as well, I actually have a lot more conversations with myself than you guys might realize, because it seems like I talk to you guys a lot and you are my sounding board for a lot of things, but I do actually talk to myself extensively as well. Anyway, so I said to Scott, one of the things that we really need to talk about is gentrification, because there's a lot of concerns that people have about that. Either they're worried about neighborhoods that they're going into might gentrify based on their own actions, or maybe they're going to go into a neighborhood that ends up gentrifying and they don't like it anymore. How do we deal with that? How should we approach that? How should we think about that? And so I do think that gentrification is a really interesting topic, but one that people don't really understand very well. And I think there's some insights. Of course, there's some well-known problems with it, but I think there's a whole world of concepts around gentrification that people aren't often taking into account, and we need to think about, especially when we're looking at being expats and interacting with a place like Nicaragua or much of Latin America. We have the potential to be important catalyst within the potential for there being gentrification. So we should be more conscientious of this than most people are. So why not get to that right after the bump? We all know what gentrification is, right? We have a area that has become run down or is less expensive, generally a barrio or a neighborhood in a city, normally how we think of it, although this does actually apply in villages and other types of municipalities. Sometimes entire regions may suffer from or exhibit gentrification. But the idea is that you have an area that is generally lower cost, you have a community feeling there that has been established over time, and as places become more affordable, quite often or from time to time, we find that people begin to move in who are looking to take advantage of the lower cost structures to possibly build something new that they couldn't afford to do somewhere else, or possibly put in new types of shops or try something new. And what happens is you end up getting one person after another who comes into a neighborhood, finds that there's good opportunities to affordably get in. You start getting a new class or a new income level of people, as probably a better way to put it, moving into a neighborhood. The prices go up over time. Generally, you have a change of services, what businesses are in the area, who they're servicing, and how the neighborhood interacts with itself begins to change over time. The people who've lived there for a long time begin to lose the traditional home that they've had. In some cases, maybe the place that they live becomes unaffordable. In places like the United States, where often gentrification will end up raising your tax base, this is particularly a problem, and we often see this as the highlighted reason why people are really against gentrification. In others, we may simply see that the style of the neighborhood changes over time and people lose interest in staying there, or the values that they used to have are no longer demonstrated by the community that they're in, and they want to move on. And so we see what we call a gentrified neighborhood, where the community that used to live there moves on, either because they need to, or because they want to, or in some cases because they attrition out and their children and grandchildren don't stay in that community, and a new group of people move in. Those people may be very closely related, but just a more affluent group of people from the same racial group or whatever. This does not require people, this is not something that is connected to expats. It's not something that's connected to immigrants. It's not something that's connected to any particular group of people. So you can go to a city that no foreigner has ever heard of in Argentina, have a poor neighborhood, and see the same thing go on. Of course, when you have immigrants and expats, which are not the same thing, we have plenty of videos that explain this before anyone thinks of once again pointing out that they don't know English and are going to argue based on words that they are misusing. Please look it up before you argue. But if you have either of those groups, you have a tendency to worry about gentrification a lot more. In the United States, we often have immigrant communities, for example, tight family Italian neighborhoods or Irish neighborhoods, and over time those become more expensive and they stop being those close-knit immigrant neighborhoods. Or in other places, you may see expats begin to move in and change neighborhoods as they're moving to a country. Generally, the people who are moving in newly are expats. The people who stay are immigrants, right? Immigrants are a subset of expats. So you tend to be concerned with immigrants because they tend to have neighborhoods of their own that we want to potentially preserve, or we think of them as something that we want to preserve. However, this is in many cases an American thing. So I want to take a moment to put an American context around this and explain that this is not the universal context. When you're in the United States, we typically think of the communities that may gentrify as being minority communities. So we have a group of immigrants who are often of lower income than the surrounding city or than some other neighborhoods. It's not always lower than average, just lower than groups that may be moving in. And often it is because they are recent immigrants. Not necessarily that the people who are living there are first generation immigrants, but they may be the direct children of immigrants and not have generational wealth accumulated yet. But in the United States, often that will come in time. And so, for example, we have seen Italian neighborhoods. That's a great example that started off as very like entire neighborhoods that are just Italian. Everyone knew each other. Everyone was family. Everyone was from the same area in Italy. My wife's family has this history behind it. And over time, as the original generation had kids, those kids were less tied to that community. And then when they had kids, they were less tied to that community. And those communities that they first lived in, that were all Italian communities, now are very mixed, are a completely different vibe than they used to be. And that just changes over time. In the United States, we tend to think of those communities as being immigrant-based. That's not always the case, but we tend to think of them that way, and it is definitely the norm. When we're looking at those communities and feeling like we need to preserve them, normally it is from a perspective of the idea that essentially enclave-like communities that are primarily minorities, generally homogenous minorities or nearly homogenous minorities, will need to have some protections. This is part of the mindset, and that's not illegitimate. There are reasons that we may want to protect and look after minority communities because they may be more fragile than other things, and they may not be able to simply move to another community across town and get the same experience that they used to have. Whereas if you're in the majority, you very easily, if you were to lose the community that you grew up in, probably can move to one nearby that's very similar and continue. So that is kind of important. But it is very important from an American context to step back and say, is that legitimately something that we should be preserving? Do minorities have an inalienable right, or do we have a responsibility to put them in a fishbowl and treat them like a zoo and say they should not be affected by open economic factors and they should be preserved as if they are an indigenous community type thing? And is that right to do as well? Should you encapsulate indigenous communities and keep them isolated so that they don't interact with the greater world equally as with other people? Generally, the answer to that is no. Once we describe what that is, that sounds absolutely horrendous, and that's something we actively would feel completely demoralized to be a part of. And so we want to be very careful with that, but that is kind of the approach we often take, is that we think that minorities need this kind of protection where they're held apart from the rest of society, and that they should be kept in kind of a poor mode, right? These when we're talking about gentrification, we're talking about a poor neighborhood turning into a richer neighborhood. So naturally, we're talking about encouraging minorities to remain with each other, caught in poverty cycles. So that's another way to phrase avoiding gentrification. That does not mean that gentrification is simply good, but it's important to understand that the underlying principle we are generally talking about is promoting multi-generational poverty, maybe not extreme poverty, but through a lens of preserving culture, but not a traditional culture, a culture that only generally arose because of a need of early generational immigrants, first, second, maybe third generation immigrants, to stick together in order to find better jobs, to keep their own businesses going, to have community protection, to have training and language resources and such that are often necessary. But those are things that are only necessary normally with those first one or two generations, and they are unfortunate that they must band together in tight-knit communities in order to protect themselves against or provide resources to help them compete against the outside world. But it's natural, and if we look at it in that way, this is a necessary evil that, while it seems charming and quaint to those of us who are seeing it from the outside, people who are inside those communities would often say, well, yes, it has its upsides, but in general, we would like to see our cousins and neighbors and associates and friends and other immigrants or third generation, people who've been there for a long time. These are full Americans, right? We would like to see them be able to integrate into society and excel and have that upward mobility the same as everyone else, much more importantly than maintaining a community that only existed as a means of staving off the risks of being an immigrant. This is not like saying, well, they moved from Italy and they need to maintain their traditional Italian bakeries, their Italian language, their Italian dress and musical heritage. Of course, those things we hope will be preserved to some degree. Everyone's culture is important, and the human experience and the human story is a great one that we all are a part of and want to tell and want to remember. But that's very different than maintaining poverty neighborhoods, barrios inside of our cities just so that we're maintaining the culture of poverty. It's literally the culture of poverty of immigrants in most cases that we're talking about. Now, if we flip this and say, well, we're looking at immigrants, for example, I'm an immigrant in Nicaragua. Now, again, we have videos that explain the difference between expats and immigrants. Immigrants are a subset of expats. I'm a true immigrant. If you were to take here in Nicaragua a group of immigrants in a community, what you have is generally enclaves. We call them expat enclaves because most of them are not here for the long haul. They're truly not immigrants. But if you had a group of us like me who were here for the long haul, put us together in a community and had this area, it would be way beyond gentrified already because we're not generally a poorer than average community inside the country struggling to try to maintain resources. We would be extremely affluent on average and would wield way too much power and influence within any given area. It would actually be ill-advised from a national perspective. It might be fine for those of us who lived in it, but overall it would probably be bad, and it wouldn't engender this really cool, quirky community of music and restaurants. It would just become a microcosm of a foreign country that we're able to import those things because we can afford to, right? So the idea that groups of immigrants are naturally going to create these kinds of things isn't really universal. That's very much an American experience thing. And of course, the same thing's going to happen in a Canada, probably in a Germany, I'm sure in the UK, and so forth. But it requires generally a relatively rich country taking in a lot of immigrants who are originally moving, or expats who originally move for the purpose of finding jobs or avoiding war or whatever, staving off intense poverty or starvation. Maybe a drought is happening somewhere, so they move as expats, and then eventually they decide to stay, become immigrant communities, become multi-generational, and you have these neighborhoods that we then worry about gentrification. So while it can happen anywhere, it is a really common part of the North American experience, and the concern about gentrification in that way is not something that we experience in other places. Here in Nicaragua, if we were to look at it in the exact same light and say, okay, so the minorities like Canadians and Americans, we need to preserve their culture in little communities and not let affluent Nicaraguans move in and overly influence them. Sounds a little bit weird. If we were so poor that that was ruining our culture, well, we might have the same kind of reaction, but that's almost impossible to imagine actually happening on scale, so we don't think of it that way. But we do sometimes apply the worries of gentrification to normal Nicaraguan barrios. These are suburbs and regions of the city, maybe wards as you would think of them in a lot of American cities. If you were to do the same thing and go to the United States and say, okay, we're not talking about an immigrant community, we're not talking about a special barrio of a certain national heritage, we're talking about just a group of long-term Americans, people who are descended from families that have been in the United States for 8-10 generations, right? People who have lost any semblance of knowledge, any concept of what countries or regions of the world they originally came from, at least with any clarity. People who blend together and just are labeled Americans, which is often something that happens in the United States. For the first several generations, you tend to be identified with whatever immigrant group you came over with, and over time that is lost. For example, my wife easily identifies as an Italian American, but her family has been there for many generations. 4 generations. She's a 4th generation on that side and way more on another. Whereas my family came over from Switzerland. Because we came from Switzerland, we are not identified as Swiss Americans because the Swiss came over so early that the majority of them blended into society in the 1700s, many before the U.S. even became a country. So they entered into the colonies, whereas the Italians often came over during the time of the 1800s or later when the United States had already formed a lot of its identity. So because of that, if you come from Italy even long, long ago, you're often still identified as an Italian American, whereas if you come from Switzerland or Germany, you often are not, because we were part of that wave in the early 1700s, as opposed to the British and Dutch, which came in the 1600s and are the ones that we were merging in with. We were Swiss Americans or Swiss colonials at one point, but we have so many hundreds of additional years, nearly 200 years, more than many Italian families, that extra time has caused everyone who comes from Switzerland to basically be merged in. So it's a little bit about how America works that way from a thought process. I'm not saying it's good, bad, right, wrong. It just is the way that it is. And in another 100, 150 years, you're going to find most Italian groups in the exact same boat, to have, no pun intended, to have blended in, and no one will know one group from another. They'll mostly have lost their identities. My Swiss identity is very weak in the United States, whereas my wife's Italian identity, while weak, is much stronger than my Swiss one. In Nicaragua, you're going to have the same thing. People who've been in Nicaragua for thousands of years, their families don't really need these protections. Every single neighborhood in the country is already much like all the others. And if one of them gentrifies, they can just move on to another. Just like my family, no matter where I grew up, whether it's in a big city, whether it's in a barrio, whether it's in the country, if my particular area happened to become gentrified and I didn't want to stay there, I could move nearly anywhere in the United States, or at least over, say, a quarter of the United States, and find culture nearly identical to where I grew up. And I just had the power to do that because I'm in the majority. Same thing would happen here. So we have to be careful applying concepts that we apply to immigrant minority communities, primarily in the United States, to majority communities in Nicaragua, because essentially, while the underlying mechanisms of gentrification may be similar, the overall effects and the way that everything behaves and the way people are impacted is completely different in nearly every way. And the thought processes of this is something we need to preserve go away. As Americans, we think of Nicaraguans as being immigrants, even when they're in their own country. So we often have this reaction that we need to look after these communities and protect them as if they're not the majority in their own country. But that's not the case, and it's mostly simply a emotional reaction that we haven't thought all the way through. Also, in the way that America tends to zone, whether intentionally or just naturally, we have these regions that are very, very isolated and are tight communities that can be easily identified. It's normal to have a community, let's say Ward 1 of Chicago is going to have a relatively uniform cost of living, access to resources, style of home, and so forth. And so we have this homogeny within a small zone that allows for gentrification to be really easily identified. If you come to Nicaragua, we've done some videos on this, but it's been a long time. What we often have is a very different thing, where any given barrio or community is going to be a mix of the very poor and the relatively affluent living right next to each other. You don't have rich neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods per se. There's a little bit of that, of course, right? Santo Domingo in Managua is a rich neighborhood. Villa Fontana is a rich neighborhood, whereas San Judas or Villa Libertad or Villa Venezuela are very poor communities. So there's regions that are much richer and much poorer throughout the city. Same thing here in Leon. Fatima is relatively rich. Sutiava is relatively poor. But in all of those communities, whether you go to Fatima and look at all the nice houses, you go around the corner, you're going to find some really, really poor houses. Some places you could easily afford for $10,000, $15,000. Come to Sutiava and you can easily find giant mansions as well. Some of the biggest mansions of the city are in one of the poorest areas. People do not have this, our entire region has to be all rich or poor feeling in the way that America does. It's just different mentalities and approaches, and part of it comes from zoning, part of it comes from traditions with the way that families are structured, the idea that families stay really close to each other. The United States has a lot more cars than it has for a long time, so it's really easy to live across town. When I first moved out from my parents' house, I moved easily an hour away by car, and that put me in a completely different region of the state. But here in Nicaragua, someone might move an hour away by foot and just be across town. It's a very different thing because everyone drives in the US and not very many people drive here. It's just one of many things that are very different, and so the concepts of how communities behave also is different. So what can easily gentrify in the US, what is very easily identifiable as a gentrification process that happens and that is common, here in Nicaragua is really rare. And just because someone moves in or a group of people move into a neighborhood and completely change its financial demographics does not mean that other houses within that neighborhood are going to change. In the United States, if I move into a neighborhood that is struggling and I buy the worst house on the block and I tear it down and I put up a mansion or a really cool business with beautiful apartments above it, that's going to change that block. It's going to create more development. All kinds of crazy things are going to happen. And just that one building might not be enough. But if I had a friend who did a second building, we might manually brute force the kickoff to a gentrification process that could sure take a decade or two, but could really revitalize and completely change the face of a neighborhood. Do that same thing here in Nicaragua, and chances are the value of the houses next to you will barely change. They'll change, but minimally in most cases, unless someone is looking to contiguously build against your building and start a new little community. Someone would really have to have some vision and look to do something very uncommon here for that to really take effect. In the United States, if one house goes up in value, chances are the houses around it are going to go up in value less, but to some degree as well. If you tear down the worst, you got a neighborhood, you got 10 houses on a block, and you got one house that, the average is, let's say 200,000, you got one that's only worth 100,000. You tear down that $100,000 house and you put up a $300,000 house, all the other houses are going to gain $5,000 to $10,000 of value almost instantly without doing anything, just because they have this effect of the worst went away and the best came in. Do the same thing here in Nicaragua. Take a block, find a house that's all burned down, remove it, and put in a beautiful new house that's better or more expensive than any of the other houses in the neighborhood. Is it going to raise the value of the other houses? Maybe, but by like $20 or $30, not by hundreds or thousands of dollars. You would barely notice. It's a completely different thing. People will appreciate that the neighborhood looks nicer. It'll have some positives, but it's not likely to move the financial needle in any meaningful way. It's important to understand that those effects are super different. So you don't tend to get gentrification, even when you have people moving in and doing things that would feel like the kickoff to gentrification in the United States. It's very hard to have that actually trigger a snowball style effect. And that's what gentrification depends on, is that a few people move in, a few more people move in, and soon you start getting the snowball. In Nicaragua, that's very unlikely to happen. In much of the world, it'll be somewhere in between. The US is very likely to have it. Nicaragua is very unlikely to have it, and most places are in the middle. So it can happen for sure. And even here in Nicaragua, it absolutely can happen. And you could argue that San Juan del Sur is a big example of where that has happened. However, that is more of an enclave than a gentrification process, so it's a little bit different. That was not really developed where most of those places have gone in. So gentrification normally refers to a change of places that are already there rather than a growth around areas that are already there. That definitely makes it sound a lot like a tumor. Maybe it kind of is. A lot of people, when talking about gentrification, would refer to gentrification as a process much like getting a tumor, so I kind of understand. Now let's talk about the value here of gentrification a little bit, because I think there's an underlying thing that we tend to miss. Now, I talked about how we don't want to keep people in a zoo. We don't want to treat people as if they are subhuman or that they are animals or anything like that, and that is very difficult not to do when we start trying to avoid gentrification, right? We start saying, well, we're going to assign an area, say they are poor normally in this area. That's what it means, because gentrification comes from an increase in the revenue, and say we're going to preserve them in their poverty. So we know that that is bad. Why do we not want to gentrify from a process perspective? We understand in the big high level, of course, we don't want to maintain poverty. Who would want to do that? But let's talk about why people are afraid of gentrification. So let's look at the mechanisms of what happens. So you have a neighborhood that is uniformly a lower income, and most importantly, not the income of the people, but the housing value, the property values assigned to the properties in the area. You could have very rich people living but not improving their houses and maintain low property values. That is valid but uncommon, right? So let's assume that's not the case. We're going to assume we have a lower income area where the property values are relatively low and uniformly. No one's done anything strange. Then one of the houses that is not doing very well goes up for sale. A artist collective has decided to move in. They have a group of young professionals who need to save some money because they're trying something aggressive. They want to open a gallery or something, and or maybe they want to open a cafe. You have this artist collective come in. The artists live in the lofts and apartments above, and below they build a cafe and they sell paintings, and people start coming in. And because people are coming into the cafe, it increases the rent a little bit. They took down a nasty old building. Maybe it was vacant. Maybe it was a drug house. Maybe it was just not well kept, and they turned it into something cute. They have enough money and time to paint it and do some repairs and put in new plants and just upgrade it in a minor way. We're not talking about tearing down the structure. We're talking about a relatively basic process, but they take something that was an eyesore or was empty or abandoned and turn it into something lively and valuable. Now they have more people living in the neighborhood. They're living in potentially attractive, small, but attractive apartments above that they have renovated to some degree. They have this cafe on the first floor that is generating some new revenue and possibly bringing some people in from the outside. Some of their friends from other neighborhoods around the city come and visit them to look at their artwork, to hang out, to maybe work from their cafe for the day. Those people start looking around and say, hey, this isn't that bad of a neighborhood. My friends live here. I have enough money to buy a house in this neighborhood. I'm going to, look and see what's available. Now, no one is forced out. Gentrification does not imply, it certainly does not imply that anyone has to sell their homes. It is only in the US that the idea that raising the value of a neighborhood would raise their taxes and make people who live there for a long time unable to afford the house that they already own applies. That is not a thing that most people fear. Yes, in America, it can be a negative thing. And there are reasons why raising taxes forcibly on people is bad. But we shouldn't be mad at the gentrification process for that. We should be mad at a corrupt tax system for that. No one should be taxed in that way on property that they can't realize benefits from. Right? That is taxing unrealized things is dangerous. I understand with billionaires, like you can do whatever, but for normal people, that is a really dangerous process, a really painful process to say that, when you were 20, you were able to afford this home, the same job you've always had, you've never taken a cut, and now you can't afford the home that you've had all this time, you've poured your life into, and you have to sell it, and you have to sell it for what someone's willing to give you. You can't wait for a good price. That is terrible. That's an American tax problem, and it does not apply to every place in America. That's just part of America. So very isolated, common, but very isolated. If you're here in Nicaragua, that would never happen, right? So it's a very different thing. In most of the world, that would not happen. So assume that that is not something we're discussing when looking at gentrification, especially in this region. So you have people who are making offers on houses. Well, I'm going to go door to door. I want to be close to here. So they're just going to walk around, right? We talk about you got to be on the ground walking around in Nicaragua to buy a house. So same thing. You walk around, you talk to the neighbors, and someone has a house that they're like, you know what? I'd like to sell it. I'd like to move to an apartment. I didn't know anyone would buy my house. So I didn't have it on the market. I haven't been looking. But I'm so excited that someone is willing to pay me and willing to pay me more than my neighbors would. Like maybe the neighbor from this poor community would spend $20,000 to buy this house, but this person who's come in from abroad is willing to spend 22, 23, maybe 25,000 on that same house because they can. Right. And so now this person is very excited and they sell their house and maybe they, can demand a premium because no one else is willing to sell. And so it makes sense that someone who really wants to move into that neighborhood will pay a small premium to do so. And they're happy to pay it. The person is getting a windfall. They're taking something that they thought was a very minimal and non-liquid asset that now they can turn into a larger liquid asset and get more from. Maybe they're able to retire because of it. Maybe they're able to live with family somewhere else because of it. Maybe they're able to get an apartment that they've always wanted or move to another country, anything. This is a lot of power and it's completely optional. If it isn't good for the person, they won't make the deal, right? So this is completely empowering one person in this neighborhood to have a better life by their own decision, right? So that can happen a few times. As that happens, the neighborhood starts to gentrify, right? And the idea that everyone can find a buyer that is interested in their home above the traditional market value drives a lot of desire to, okay, we got to unload our homes. And one by one, people get upward mobility. This is an opportunity to move to a new neighborhood that may help have them get good access to more connections for improvements with jobs or communities that are better suited for their needs because they're stage of life has changed or whatever. People who want to stay can. Now, of course, the community that used to be there will change over time, but that is the nature of things. It is honestly quite strange to look at any given community and treat it as something that has the right to remain static. That is not built into anything. The world changes constantly. Technology changes. We change our roads. We don't keep old cars that use leaded gasoline and don't have seatbelts on the road and let people drive them, because that's dangerous and inefficient. It's bad for the planet. It's bad for the people in the cars. So we advance over time. We make things better intentionally, and not always, but we try to. Gentrification is an improvement, a natural, organic part of the urban renewal process. This is what healthy urban renewal looks like. If you try to curtail gentrification, what you end up with is arbitrarily non-organic growth, where people in poor neighborhoods are stuck without the ability to naturally improve their environments. And even if they went out as individuals and said, okay, we've all earned a little bit more money, we're going to start improving our neighborhood, they can't get the payoffs from that because we prevent gentrification. You don't want that. You want people able to invest in their homes and be treated as equals with everyone else and have that upward mobility. That's literally what we're talking about. Gentrification is a healthy, organic part of urban renewal that helps poorer neighborhoods, especially those that trend towards being immigrants or minorities, and helps them have a greater amount of upward mobility and social mobility that would often be limited from them. In the rest of society, when we're talking about already more affluent neighborhoods or areas without a large minority population, in the United States at least, we assume that over time you gain social and economic mobility by investing in real estate. And we would never, ever accept the idea of forcibly taking that away from any group. We would fight against that naturally because we are investing. It's like saying, oh, sure, you can start your own business, but we're all going to agree not to shop there because, you know, we don't want you being successful. It'll change your social status. That's abhorrent. Doing the same thing with real estate, equally abhorrent. And it's worse because it targets the most vulnerable. So we really actually do, in many cases, want gentrification. Again, we don't want a tax burden creating a forced pressure. In the example that I give, if this was to happen in Nicaragua, it's still extremely rare. But if it was to happen, anyone who wants to remain in their old house, this is the house where my kids grew up, I don't want to give it up. There's nothing that's going to make them have to give it up. There's no pressure to do that. The only pressure is people offering them more and more money for that house. And at some point, if being offered double or triple what the house is actually worth otherwise, or what it was worth when you bought it, is worth so much money that it's going to completely change your life, chances are that is better for you than maintaining that nostalgic connection to where your children grew up. Trust me, I know. I miss my house in New York where my eldest daughter was born. I miss my house in Texas where my youngest daughter was born. I wish that I could keep those things, but selling them and moving to a place that's better for us is way better for our family than just clinging to things and letting objects like houses own us. Way better to control our lives and have a really meaningful life with my children than to have a meaningful life with the house that my children were once in. That sounds obvious, but that's not how people tend to react. So gentrification in many, many circumstances actually represents really good things. There is a social pressure in the United States to discourage gentrification because it empowers and helps to offset a lack of empowerment often found in minority communities, and it helps the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor, or in this case, the moderately rich to stay rich and the moderately poor to stay moderately poor. We don't tend to apply these same things to extreme poverty or to extreme wealth, but this is an area where we see the same artifacts happening in society at a much lesser point. But it sounds so good, as many things do. Watch Star Trek. The Prime Directive sounds good on the surface, but when you actually pay attention to it, it really is saying that those who are powerful and colonial masters should have the right to literally encapsulate and imprison those who are not yet at their advanced level and treat them like zoo animals and observe them and literally block them from having free open commerce and interactions with the rest of the universe. Star Trek is theoretical. It gets a little bit silly when you start trying to break it down, but it's literally what's going on. It would be much if European colonial powers came over to the New World, encapsulated the population, and put them into a zoo that they couldn't see the walls. So much like many zoo animals, they would be completely captured and imprisoned, but may not be aware of it and only believe that they were in a much smaller world than they really were in. And any potential interactions, natural interactions that may happen with people on the outside, things that would allow them to learn new things, to share ideas, to have international commerce and grow their economic power and begin to potentially compete against those colonial entities, would be held off by the colonial powers. And they would say, no, if you want to trade with them, we'll control the trade to make sure that they have no idea what the market value of things is, or that a market even exists. We will ensure that the amount is controlled by us. They will basically enslave them. It's just an enslavement that people aren't aware of, which is probably better than actual enslavement, but probably is a stretch. It's kind of like the Truman Show, but on a racial scale. So if you think about it in that context, obviously we don't want to do that. Obviously no one would approve that. Nobody ever would think something like that was okay. Of course, that is what we do in Papua New Guinea, and many of the world's colonial powers agreed that they would actually do exactly this. They would keep the world from interacting with them. We would keep them as racial prisoners up in the mountains. They still exist this way today, and they actually have entire groups of churches that work by translating things from the outside world for them, so that they never have to be exposed to outside languages, to make sure that they never have the power to do research, to learn about the internet, to read books, to learn about the outside world without it being carefully controlled by colonial powers. So when you think about it in that way and realize that this is something that they do today, that the US, Canada, England, and countries like that actively do and put in enormous resources to keep the people of Papua New Guinea as essentially prisoners in an open-air prison on an island, and maintain that nobody can go visit them and accidentally teach them about the outside world so that they can make decisions on their own. Everything is kept away, including keeping planes from flying over in most cases, so they never get curious as to the outside world. They never have those open, free interactions the way that other countries did, that allowed other countries to develop weapons and technology and financial structures to make them able to compete on the world stage. We are literally treating them as animals and do not consider them humans. This is a very real thing. We do the same thing on a few islands with just a tiny population off the southwest coast of India. That one's a little bit different because the people on the island actively try to keep people away when they come by boats. And so we can kind of excuse it as just honoring their wishes, but it's still, it's not open. It's illegal for anyone to go and try to interact with them. Anyone who tries to bring them information about the outside world, anyone who tries to befriend them is potentially going to be arrested. That we have to do that. Now, if we just left people to their own devices, that's one thing, but to actively maintain a prison status, even if it's open air, of any people, that is what, when we try to avoid gentrification, we're going down that path, a very minor part of that path, but we are still going down that path. We are trying to interrupt their freedom to gain value from their own investments, real estate and housing in this case, and maintain poverty by keeping gentrification from happening, because that is, in most cases, their path out of that community. Their ability to move to the rest of the world comes from being able to sell at good value the houses that they have. Of course, we don't want that to happen. If we're going to buy those houses, we want to make sure they stay as cheap as, we being the majority, right? We want to make sure that those houses stay at the lowest value possible. We want to make sure that we're getting the value. We want to buy them all before it gentrifies, then sell it when it gentrifies with us, and no one cares because the minorities are already gone. So the people who were poor, they never got the money from it. They ended up moving on because we buy it slowly without gentrifying. Then it can gentrify from a majority point, and it's a really effective pattern that people use under the guise of working in nonprofits, under the guise of protecting minority communities. We're actually putting them in a fishbowl, treating them like it's a zoo, like they're animals, and curtailing their ability to operate on a free market and advance their social position. So something that I'm very passionate about, that in many cases, the place that we come from where we want to avoid gentrification comes from being told all these negatives about it without questioning them, because why would we question them? What a weird place for people to make up this whole structure of trying to manipulate people, and yet it actually happens. So what is the takeaway from this? When you're looking at coming to Nicaragua, you're looking at investing. If you're looking at enclaves, it doesn't matter, because you're already talking about groups of immigrants or expats, and depending on the case, where they're already isolated and none of this really matters. But when you're looking at moving into a barrio, a lot of people instantly, some of them say it and some of them just think it, right? Well, I would like to move into that barrio, but I want a house that might be significantly above average. Maybe it's not the best house in the neighborhood, but it's going to be in closer to the best house in the neighborhood than to a median house. And am I going to contribute to gentrification? Well, you may contribute to the improving of that neighborhood. You might help make it more safe. You may help bring in better services. You may help encourage some things that are good to happen. And there are some real consequences potentially. If you displace a family who is shopping at a pulperia all the time and you don't shop at that pulperia, you could have a negative impact on some local businesses. businesses. So you might want to pay attention to how you're impacting the community and do things to try to help support those businesses. But also, sometimes businesses need to rise and fall naturally, and that has to happen. We don't want anyone to lose their business, but everyone who loses a business now can go out and try a different business that might be more valuable and needed for the community, or maybe they can go work for someone else who has a different type of job and career that they need, and they can advance the overall community by providing a much needed service. So the market forces, while not perfect, tend to be one of the best things that we have for guiding where money should go and what businesses should run, and businesses that are successful and needed will rise, and those that are not needed will fall. Of course, we know being rich tends to make people rich, being poor tends to make people poor, so the system is not perfect, but within the confines of which pulperias, which restaurants should be making it, generally market forces dictate that places with food that people want to eat are going to succeed, and places that sell things that nobody needs in their community are not going to succeed. And so evolving over time is part of running a business. And yes, in Nicaragua, micro businesses with very little ability to adapt are ones that are more vulnerable, and we don't necessarily want to put them in danger. So it is valuable when you're looking at moving into a neighborhood. Don't worry about increasing the value of the neighborhood. That is not a serious risk. And even if it was a risk, that is not a negative in 99% of cases. But what you may do is interrupt the amount that people are going to local restaurants, shopping at local pulperias. And so you may want to encourage yourself to do that. Leverage the pulperia across the street, eat at the local restaurant, maybe even do more than the people who lived there before, and help build a stronger community economy rather than a weaker one. That may take a little bit of intent on your part, but it's something you generally can do. With a little bit of research and a little bit of caring, you may be able to do that. And I'm going to do some videos and talk about the Chinese threat that people see, and how foreign investment and the new Chinese businesses may have some unintended negatives, but some misunderstood positives that people are not thinking through, because it's very similar, right? We're worried about the natural economic forces of the world being allowed to play out. And while there are times we want to interrupt the natural economic forces, generally open markets are the best performing for everyone. It is not a game where one side wins and one side loses. When the market is open and free, generally everyone benefits at the end of the day, as long as the playing field is kept level. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee. The link above, buymeacoffee.com/ScottAlanMiller, and you can join with the join button down there with a small monthly contribution to help maintain the cost of doing the show. It does take a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of equipment and licenses to make a show like this, so it's really important for all of you who do contribute. It really does make a difference for sure. And of course, like, subscribe, go down, ask your comments, ask your questions, leave your comments, ask your comments, leave your questions, say hello, watch another episode, tell someone about the show, and I will see all of you tomorrow.